I'm Scott, this is my show. I got Will Grigg coming up on the show, and Will, he wrote a thing, and it ain't about the cops. It's about anti-Muslim bigotry. You know, I was just reading this thing over at The Intercept a moment before going on today by Murtaza Hussain. Friend of the show. And the article is about Bill Maher and how this guy's not edgy, he's just a bigot. And so I was thinking, yeah, that's right. But anyway, so Will Grigg, he's got an article along those lines, only the guys that Will Grigg is after here, they are far worse than stupid old Bill Maher. These are the guys who say that the only solution is to kill all the Muslims.
Well, hello there. As I said, I was going to make a video about the Muslims. About 2 weeks ago, I heard that there's a movement out there that's pushing to kill all Muslims. This is where I heard it from. So I apologize about the background noise. I think it's coming from the iPad. This is a 2-hour show, so I can't share it all with you, but I will share the most important parts. I stopped it here because Bill Maher was mentioned. And yeah, he's not my fan. He's very popular. People think he's intelligent, and unfortunately people mistaken arrogance for intelligence, and that's kind of sad. But his only talent is insulting others.
How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Scott. Thank you so much for your kind words.
Well, you know, you're just the best at writing stuff, and this is a topic where, you know, it's really usually liberals and left-wingers who are good on this, and so it's good to have your, I think, kind of formerly right-wing, now more libertarian, but still never left liberal point of view to take on this problem here and maybe in a way, explain it in a way maybe that people can understand, maybe people who are predisposed to kind of, you know, more or less at least accept some of the premises of the arguments that you're attacking here, if not their conclusions. So anyway.
I hope so.
Yeah, very important stuff. So, who's Ishmael, who's got to crush him, and what Muslim problem, and what are you talking about? What am I talking about?
In the book of Genesis, we read about Ishmael as being Abram, the future Abraham's son, by way of a concubine named Hagar. And Ishmael is conventionally considered to be the father of the Arab ethnic cohort. And if you talk to a devout Muslim, chances are he will identify himself as a child of Abraham by way of Ishmael. Now, in some, but by no means all, precincts of evangelical Christianity, you'll find people who will assert that because of this dodgy bloodline, that Arabs in general, Muslims in particular, have to be looked upon as the inveterate enemies of God and of God's people, meaning Christians and Jews. And there is a rather splenetic character who deems himself some kind of a pastor by the name of Gary Cass, who used to be associated with a number of very high-profile ministries, who has written an essay in which he says that it is nothing less than the sacred duty of Christians to crush the seed of Ishmael, the vicious seed of Ishmael, in order to bring about the triumph of God's purposes. And what that means is that we have to recognize, supposedly, that all Muslims everywhere are irreducibly the enemies of Christians and of all decency. They are at best latent ISIS-style deranged killers, and at worst, of course, they give full rein to those impulses. That being the case, we have three potential ways of dealing with the problem of Muslims living in the United States. The first is to convert them, and according to Mr. Cass, this is impossible because they are of the completely incorrigible seed of Ishmael. They are genetically predisposed to be vessels of wrath. They were created for that purpose. And we're not going to see a mighty move of God among them because God has ordained that these people are irredeemable. So there may be one of a family and two of a city who would be receptive to the message of the Christian gospel, but we shouldn't believe that this would be in any sense representative of a potential mass conversion. Besides that, we've heard from no less an authority than Phil Robertson, who is the patriarch of the Duck Dynasty clan and hence one of our foremost public theologians, that our choices are either to convert them or kill them, and he's not optimistic that the former is going to avail us. So we can scratch option 1 off that list. The second possibility is either mass sterilization of Muslims in order to deal with their fecundity, or mass expulsion of Muslims because they tend to propagate themselves faster than we could sterilize them. Given the fact that nobody is going to consent to be sterilized against his or her will, and given the fact that we're dealing with millions of people, that's not a particularly good option either, according to Mr. Cass. He, by the way, created a rather charming acronym for this element of his agenda, DAMN, DAM, meaning depart all Muslims now. So that leaves us with what he considers to be the only biblically sound approach, which is mass violence, meaning not only, of course, defensive violence, and I am not indisposed toward the idea that there are circumstances where purely defensive violence is justified. I have great respect for pacifism. I don't happen to embrace that perspective. So I do believe in the right of armed self-defense where necessary, although I'll go to extreme lengths in order to avoid that eventuality, because that is a tragedy any way you look at it. But he's talking about the idea, literally, of a war of extermination that would know no boundaries. Because as long as these people exist in the same physical continuum with us, and as long as they are possessed of this ideology that he finds to be incurably vile, and as long as they are cursed with a genetic legacy that he considers to be dispositive, we will never know freedom or safety or peace. That means that we have to move toward the idea of killing as many people as necessary in order to make a better world, meaning from his perspective and not mine, a Muslim-free world for our children and grandchildren. And this...
Okay, I have to cut in here. It's said that bigotry comes from ignorance, and in this case it's obviously true. Muslims follow a religion, just like Christians follow a religion. They're not a part of a race of people. And evidence of this is most Asians are Muslim, or most of the Muslims in the world are Asian and not Arab.
Children and grandchildren. And this fellow, who has a caricatured, gravity-defying pompadour, descends upon pulpits across the country and has a great deal of influence within that strain, and it's one strain among many, I hasten to specify and emphasize, of evangelical Christianity. I believe he's a Presbyterian or Calvinist background himself. But his message resonates with the sort of people who consider Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity to be fountains of wisdom. And their numbers are many, and they're happily, I think, located toward the decaying end of the demographic curve. I mean, you're talking about people who are not on the sunlit side of 50 for the most part. But there is, unfortunately, a large and fairly formidable club these people wield. They punch well above their weight, to alter the metaphor, when you talk about electoral politics. People in that demographic cohort vote, and they mobilize people to vote, whether you're talking about defending Social Security or supporting the warfare state. And that's one of the reasons why I think that what this person has said and written, and he doesn't have a whole lot of influence beyond that demographic, but within that demographic he's a heavyweight. And it's because the fact that he can leverage that influence within the Fox News constituency and voting bloc that I think that's worthy of our attention, especially given that he's not exactly an outlier. We have people like retired Lieutenant Colonel James Zumwalt, who's a Marine who was involved in Vietnam and the invasion of Panama and the First Gulf War, and he's somebody who's constantly on television or writing for journals that deal with public and military policy. When he uses the expression final solution non-ironically and talks about the need to hasten the extinction of Muslims, not merely Muslim terrorist groups, and he gives us the entire litany of all these terrorist groups, including people like Al-Shabaab, who are not a threat to the United States by any definition. As far as I can tell, this is a revolutionary response to American imperialism in Africa that doesn't pose any threat to the homeland, as now we're prompted to refer to it. But not merely terrorist groups, but also Muslims who are victimized by terrorist groups because they're possessed of what he considers to be the same death wish. And so it's a form of severe mercy from the perspective of Lieutenant Colonel Zumwalt to kill people indiscriminately, because in that way we're granting the fondest wish not only of the suicide bombers who crave martyrdom and the jihadists who are likewise motivated, but also their victims who aspire to the same afterlife, and so presumably would be doing the world a favor and doing them an individualized favor by consummating their religious aspirations. This is the mindset of people who are discussing these things openly in the United States of America in the year of our Lord 2014, many of whom profess to be Christians, and some of whom have very large audiences. And this is happening, of course, amid the threat, the perceived and much overhyped threat of ISIS, and in conjunction with events like the murder in Moore, Oklahoma, that had no colorable connection at all whatsoever to Islamic theology, but yet is being treated as if it were the opening salvo in a domestic jihad by the fifth columnist among us.
All right, we'll be right back with Will Grigg after this, y'all.
Okay, the rest of it, I'll leave a link below so you can listen to the rest of it. It's very interesting. There is one thing he did say next that I disagree with. He says that the Muslims don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Messiah means. For many Christians, Messiah means that Jesus is God. But the exact interpretation of Messiah means that Jesus is the King of the Jews. And a little bit more than a king. Someone who will set the Jews free and create a Jewish kingdom upon the whole earth. And this is what the true meaning of Messiah means. And of course this is why the Jews rejected Jesus, because he didn't do that. But the Christians will explain that that this was supposed to happen when he comes again. And because the Jews rejected him, now everybody who believes in Jesus will now be a Jew. And when Jesus returns, he will build his kingdom on earth, encapsulating the entire world. And all of those who believe in him will now be Jews, just like the Jews. And also, there will be a judgment when Jesus returns. Everyone will be judged. The Christians believe this. Of course, there is a certain sect of Christians who do not believe they'll be judged. But most Christians believe this. And believe it or not, the Muslims believe this. They believe the very same thing as the Christian, except for the part about the Jews, about people becoming Jews. But they do believe the same thing as the Christians. And how Jesus will judge, if you want to know how that will happen, read Matthew 25:31 to 46. It's good reading. And I think most Muslims would even agree with those scriptures. Now, what do the Muslims have to say about the Judgment Day? Because you probably don't have a Qur'an, I'll read it to you. Here, the Qur'an. It's in Surah 2:62. Those who believe in the Qur'an and those who follow the Jewish scriptures and the Christians and the Sabians and who believe in Allah and the last day and work righteousness shall have their reward with their Lord. On them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. Now that is in the first part of the Qur'an. And did you notice that it talked about how Jews and Christians should be killed? No, you didn't. There are scriptures in the Qur'an that sort of indicate something like this, but you have to know your history to understand what these scriptures talk about. There was a war going on at the time, and our early church, early Christian church, the most powerful part of the early Christian church, not all of them, just the most powerful part, because if you study history, you'll find that the Muslims actually protected Christians and Jews from this very violent group of Christians who would destroy anyone who did not believe in the Trinity. Just like today, there's a lot of argument about the Trinity within the current Christian faith. Back then there was too, but it was a little bit more of an argument. It was more like a war. And for those who didn't confess the Trinity, they were tortured. And then after they confessed that they believed in the Trinity, then they were mercifully put to death. And not just within the cities where this Christianity existed, but they also went out and searched for people who didn't believe this same thing and murdered them. And they were much more cruel and much more, beheading is is much more merciful compared to what these people did. ISIS doesn't even compare. And if you don't believe me, research it for yourself. Now also, it's often said, and you'll even hear it in this the clip there that I shared with you, that it's being told that the Qur'an is full of violence. And people even claim they've read it so they know that it's full of violence. Well, obviously they haven't read the Bible, or they haven't read the Qur'an. But while I haven't read all the Qur'an, I've read half of it, I have read the Bible. And so far, from what I've read in the Qur'an, I haven't read anything that comes close to the violence that you'll find in the Bible. For example, in the Bible, it tells us that if your children are disrespectful, you should stone them. And nothing even comes close to that I've found in the Qur'an so far. So, for these so-called Christians to claim that the Qur'an is full of violence, it's kind of hypocritical, because either they haven't read their Bible or they're just plain hypocrites. The KKK, did you know that they call themselves Christian? But if you ask a Christian, are the KKK, are they Christian? The Christian will obviously reply saying, no, they're not Christian. Well, guess what? ISIS says that they're Muslim. But if you ask a Muslim on the street, they will most likely tell you that ISIS is not Muslim. Now, how did ISIS become so powerful? It's assumed that they're being supported by other Muslims, and this is how they have become so powerful. But that is very false. And I won't get into that here, but I will explain to you that, let's say China and Russia decided to invest a lot of money into the KKK to overthrow their own government. It could happen, and if it did happen, you would have something like you have ISIS in America. A group of people who are very powerful, well weaponized, they don't have to work for a living, and they're fighting with our government. There's terrorism in the street, killing all non-believers. We'd have the very same thing. So what does Christian mean? Well, it's supposed to mean that you're a follower of Jesus Christ. Christ means Messiah. So you're a follower of Jesus the Messiah. And if you read the Gospels, nowhere does Jesus teach that you should kill people. So if anyone who says that they're a Christian advocates the killing of Muslims, they are not Christian, because they're not following what Jesus Christ would have taught. End of discussion. The name of this video is God Loves Muslims, and there's another verse from the Qur'an that I'll also share with you in the footnotes. Peace and love.